Hello, folks, and welcome to Author Adjacent, a podcast about the journey from hobbyist writer to professional author. I'm your host, Michael Vadney. If you're listening to this, you may not be ready to call yourself an author. Even I'm not there yet, but I am Author Adjacent. Before we dive into today's episode, a quick reminder. While I'm not a professional author, I have spent hundreds of hours researching writing topics and put hundreds of thousands of words to the page. As another writer on the journey from hobbyist to professional, I started this podcast to share what worked for me in the hopes that it will aid you on your own journey. Kind of like a, it's dangerous to go alone, here, take my life experience. Of course, you'll need to try things and see what works for you. With that out of the way, let's jump into today's topic. In this episode of Author Adjacent, we will be learning about, character tropes. We'll cover what a character trope is, go over a few common tropes, and learn strategies to use them the right way to keep our novels, well, novel. See what I did there? I made a pun. What? You didn't like it? Well, it was more for me than you anyways. But let's move on to the first segment. Segment 1. What are character tropes? First, let's back it up to what is a trope? It's a story pattern used by authors and other storytellers to give the reader a lot of information very quickly. In the case of character tropes, they are familiar archetypes representing reoccurring character types or roles seen in stories. They are essential building blocks of the narrative, providing readers with recognizable personalities and dynamics that shape the overall story. Because character tropes will feel familiar to the reader, it helps establish expectations and give them an idea of what kind of story they're getting into. Understanding character tropes and how to use them allows authors to effectively communicate the complex ideas and emotions of their narrative by playing off that familiarity. It's essentially a shortcut that makes it unnecessary for you, the storyteller, to explain every nuance of that character, because the reader gets the idea based on the stories they've consumed in the past. For instance, when a narrative introduces a character who is destined to complete some action due to a legend, birthright, or prophecy, the reader generally knows that the character will face many trials and obstacles, but will ultimately triumph in the vast majority of stories. The reader recognizes the chosen one trope, even if they don't know what it's called. It's important to note that a trope is not a cliché. Unlike clichés, which are by definition stale and overused, tropes are reoccurring dynamics that can be either fresh and innovative, traditional yet engaging, or honestly in some cases they can still be annoying. But that's more of a personal opinion on the trope itself. A trope is inherently neither negative nor positive. It's simply a pattern, while a cliché is a pattern that has garnered a lot of baggage along the way. A straightforward example of a character trope is the hero. The hero is the character who embarks on a journey or quest, typically distinguished by bravery, selflessness, and a strong sense of justice. Think of characters like Luke Skywalker from Star Wars or Superman from the DC Comics. While this trope is often cast as the protagonist of the narrative, that is not always the case. In the movie Megamind, the antagonist Metro Man is almost a perfect mold of the hero character trope. But we'll learn more about that in the next segment. Segment 2. Types of character tropes. It may surprise you to learn that all character tropes can be linked to a set of core archetypes that appear repeatedly in stories around the world. These universal characters even appear in the legends of cultures that have had little to no contact with the rest of the world. Fortunately for us, literary theorists have undertaken the task of organizing these archetypes into 8 distinct categories, which we will now explore so that we can recognize them when we address the tropes themselves. Number 1. Protagonist. The protagonist is the primary character of the story. Beyond any and all other traits, a character fulfills this archetype simply by having the story be about them. While the protagonist is often a hero trope, not all protagonists are heroes, as we mentioned with Megamind. Number 2. Antagonist. The antagonist is the character or force that opposes the protagonist. By default, they do not have to be a villain or even morally repugnant, though they tend to be. Their primary role is to oppose, block, or impede the protagonist. Number 3. Reason. The reason can be described as the character inclined to prioritize the rules, logic, and the greater good in all of their decisions. In essence, this character always thinks before acting, ensuring careful consideration in their actions. Primary example of this archetype is Spock from Star Trek. After all, it's only logical. Or Data, the android also from Star Trek. Even the Borg, a race of hive mind beings that are frequent antagonists in Star Trek, are driven by clear reason, making the Star Trek franchise riddled with logic-driven badasses. Number 4. Emotion. You guessed it, the emotional archetype is characterized by its emotional and humanistic nature. This character deeply cares about others, prioritize doing what they perceive as right without regard for convenience and no room for moral ambiguity. They tend to focus on the immediate reality over long-term consequences. In the Harry Potter series, this trope is fulfilled by Ron Weasley, as his actions and thoughts are often about the immediate emotional needs of the three main characters. Number 5. Sidekick. The sidekick archetype is fulfilled by any character that acts as a friend or helper to the protagonist. Geez, you would think as much as we bring up the protagonist, the whole story revolves around him. Yeah, sorry about that. Anyways, the sidekick's purpose is to give the protagonist another character to play off. They often serve as a foil, a literary technique that brings contrast to something. In this case, the sidekick often provides contrast to the protagonist, emphasizing the main character's qualities and motivating them to take action or advance the plot. They can also act as a stand-in for the reader, asking questions so that other characters can explain to them different aspects of the narrative. For most of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Samwise Gamgee acts as the sidekick to Frodo Baggins as he helps Frodo through the trials of their journey. He provides an outlet for the reader to see Frodo's growing strain in their interactions, and literally carries him at times. Can anyone say real MVP? Number 6. Skeptic. The primary role of the skeptic within the plot is to act as a contrarian, consistently pointing out flaws and raising doubts about the protagonist's plans, thereby creating obstacles for their progress. Although the skeptic may appear as merely a whiny little naysayer, they often serve as a devil's advocate, challenging the plan even if they agree with its motives or objectives. In this case, their aim is to ensure that the leader avoids any actions that could be easily criticized and to discover any oversights before they become a problem. In Shaun of the Dead, the character David is seen constantly poking at Shaun's plans for saving the group from a zombie apocalypse. In this case, his skepticism didn't help the group, despite having some solid points, but the archetype still applies. Number 7. The Guardian. The Guardian, or Mentor as it's sometimes called, is typically a wise and experienced individual who guides and advises the protagonist, offering valuable insights and lessons to help them navigate their journey. Guardians often provide crucial support and encouragement without which the protagonist could not succeed. For an example of the Guardian, look no further than Gandalf from Lord of the Rings as he guides multiple members of the Fellowship along their journey. Number 8. The Contagonist. The Contagonist is a key character, often serving as a secondary antagonist opposing the protagonist. They usually align with the antagonist, but have distinctly different goals. And if you're starting to get mixed up between all the agonists, don't worry, it happens to the best of us. I've had to record this line at least 7 times. Sometimes the Contagonist shares a personal connection with the protagonist, but that is not always the case. This archetype often presents itself as a final challenge for the protagonist before confronting the climax. In many cases, reflecting a darker aspect of the main character, the Contagonist showcases the main character's growth or regression since the start of the story. Darth Vader from the original Star Wars trilogy is a contagonist to Luke Skywalker's protagonist. Luke must face off against Vader before confronting the true antagonist, Emperor Palpatine. Sorry, not sorry that a lot of those examples are fantasy or sci-fi, but I am what I am, and I'm pretty proud of that. It is from these 8 archetypes that all character tropes derive their attributes. They can either be a subtrope of an archetype or a combination of multiple archetypes. In either case, this is a great foundation to build upon as we go over 5 popular character tropes, including some of my favorites. The anti-hero. This character trope usually embodies cynicism and solitude, accompanied by significant character flaws. It can be easy to get sucked into their dark and alluring persona, evidenced by the massive fan base of Walter White from Breaking Bad. While they propel the narrative forward like a traditional hero, their actions often lead to morally ambiguous outcomes. This trope can be a lot of fun to base your character off of, but requires a delicate balance to keep them from becoming too dark as to fall into villainy or too good as to come across as a typical hero character. Dexter Morgan from the Dexter television series is another great example of this trope. Dexter works as a forensic analyst for the Miami Metro Police Department by day, but by night he indulges his dark urge to kill serial criminals who have evaded justice. Despite his gruesome actions, he adheres to a strict code of ethics, thereby placing him in the anti-hero trope category. The Chosen One. The Chosen One is a frequently seen character trope in fantasy narratives. These characters are often defined by a specific destiny or mission assigned to them, which they pursue with unwavering determination. This trope has been on its way out of fashion for a number of years at this point, but new and creative ways of showcasing this character trope are still emerging from unexpected places. Neville Longbottom from the Harry Potter series is a surprising fulfillment of this trope. While Harry Potter is the primary chosen one to defeat Voldemort, Neville also fulfills a crucial role in the prophecy. Both born at the end of July to parents who defied Voldemort, Neville's bravery and growth becomes pivotal in Voldemort's defeat. Thus, Neville serves as a secondary chosen one or parallel protagonist in the story. I suppose I should have mentioned a spoiler warning before that one, but the series ended almost 20 years ago, so I don't feel too bad about it. Okay, maybe a little bad. Sorry. The Dumb Muscle. Drawing from the completely insane notion that intelligence and physical strength are mutually exclusive, the dumb muscle character trope is a prevalent supporting character, particularly in action and adventure narratives. When portrayed as an antagonist, this character is often outwitted and overpowered by the protagonist. Alternatively, when depicted as an ally, they serve as an endearing and valuable companion, offering both comic relief and practical assistance. This is a highly versatile character trope that can serve many different roles in your story, but unfortunately runs the risk of coming off as one-dimensional if this is their sole attribute. One example of where the dumb muscle trope is executed well is in the character of Hodor from George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series. Hodor is a physically imposing character known for his immense strength but limited mental capacity. However, despite his simple-mindedness, Hodor is portrayed with empathy and depth, making him a beloved and memorable character. His loyalty and selflessness showcase that there's more to him than just his physical strength. The Girl Next Door. This character is typically portrayed as a wholesome, down-to-earth, and approachable woman who embodies innocence, kindness, and relatability. She frequently becomes the main character's romantic partner, providing them with stability, comfort, and a sense of familiarity compared to other more complex romantic options. This is a great trope for young adult or romance novels, but can come across as an idealized or stereotypical representation of certain women. So like the dumb muscle, use it as a starting point for building a more well-rounded character. Stay tuned for the final segment where I'll finally get around to how an author might do that. A popular example of the girl next door trope from my generation was Mary Jane from the original Spider-Man trilogy, as she embodies many characteristics of this trope, such as kindness, warmth, and a gentle disposition, while still being a well-developed character in the series. Man, I am really aging myself in this episode. Will the march of time ever stop? Don't mind me, I'm just having an existential crisis. The Wise Old Man. The wise old man embodies a figure of profound wisdom and experience, often serving as a mentor or guide to the protagonist. Sometimes portrayed as an actual wizard with mystical powers, other times depicted as a seasoned individual who has lived through numerous trials and tribulations. The wise old man character trope serves as a valuable tool for assisting the protagonist in overcoming their challenges. However, it's crucial to exercise caution in its utilization, as excessive reliance on this trope can create the impression that the protagonist is immune to consequences, detracting from the narrative tension and the realism of your story. Obi-Wan Kenobi from the Star Wars franchise perfectly embodies this archetype. Serving as Luke Skywalker's mentor, he provides guidance and wisdom throughout Luke's journey. Segment 3. Deconstructing Tropes. In this segment, we will explore how to break down character tropes so that author-adjacent writers like us can use them to keep our stories fresh. We can either do this by subverting or inverting the character tropes we want to use, giving them a fresh twist, like a little slice of orange peel in a fine old fashion. I'll get to a few examples where other storytellers have successfully pulled this off, but first let me explain what I mean by either subverting or inverting a trope. To subvert means to overthrow or undermine something. My favorite definition of humor is the subversion of expectations. In the case of a trope, we can subvert it by setting up the plot so that the reader expects a trope to occur, then changing the direction to turn it into something else. Boom! Trope overthrown. On the other hand, an inverted trope occurs when the typical arrangement or pattern of the trope is altered in some manner, and often becoming its complete opposite, but it still fulfills that trope. Think of the monsters that are actually afraid of the kids whose beds they hide under, from Monsters, Inc. Let's dive into some examples of both. Benoit Blanc from Knives Out. At first glance, Benoit Blanc fits the mold of the super sleuth or skilled detective, a trope popularized by Sherlock Holmes. Like Sherlock, Benoit thrives on intricate puzzles, finds routines dull, and possesses keen observation skills. However, Benoit inverts the skilled detective trope with his strong southern sensibilities, which prevent him from embodying the aloof and distant persona often associated with characters like Sherlock. Instead, Benoit is always respectful and polite, and often likable in all of his encounters. It is due to these qualities that many suspects are never aware of Benoit's suspicions until he reveals them. This subtle change to the skilled detective trope makes Benoit Blanc feel refreshing and new despite a majority of his character being a straight-up copy of Sherlock Holmes. Pete the Prospector from Toy Story 2. In Toy Story 2, Pete the Prospector is initially presented as the wise old man, offering guidance to Woody and the other toys. However, a glimpse into his TV show, Woody's Roundup, reveals him as a bumbling buffoon, casting doubt on his wisdom. As the story unfolds, Pete's true motives emerge, exposing him as a selfish antagonist rather than a mentor. This character arc challenges the perception of wisdom and underscores the theme of deception. Through this character trope subversion from wise mentor to selfish villain, Toy Story 2 highlights the importance of looking beyond appearances to uncover the truth, illustrating that true wisdom may not always come from expected sources. Moraine Damodred from The Wheel of Time, written by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson. Moraine Damodred is a strong inversion of the wise old man trope, as she is neither old nor a man. While guiding the protagonist, Rand, on his journey, Moraine embodies many characteristics of the traditional mentor trope. However, as the story unfolds, Moraine's multifaceted nature both subverts and inverts the mentor character trope. Her most obvious inversion of the trope was her being a young woman in the role typically held by an old man. I know this is 2024 and gender bending isn't exactly revolutionary, but in 1990 when the first book of the series came out, it was a pretty big deal. Unlike typical mentors who offer unwavering support and guidance, Moraine breaks that mold by being secretive and manipulative, keeping important details from Rand and the other characters, causing tension among the group. This adds suspense to the story as readers wonder what her true intentions are. Furthermore, Moraine's actions challenge the notion of absolute moral authority associated with mentor character tropes. Her methods sometimes blur the lines between right and wrong. This moral ambiguity adds depth to her character and fosters critical reflection on the nature of mentorship and leadership. Overall, Moraine's subversion of the mentor trope adds depth and unpredictability to the Wheel of Time series, enhancing its appeal and thematic complexity. Alright, I hear you. You're convinced. Character tropes are fantastic, you say, and you plan to use them in all your stories. Spectacular. But hold off before you start pumping out characters from the trope factory, because there are three major problems associated with relying too heavily on character tropes. First, it can result in predictability, where readers anticipate character behavior or story outcomes based on familiar archetypes, diminishing the element of surprise and suspense. Second, overuse of tropes may lead to characters feeling cliché or one-dimensional, lacking depth and complexity that allows your reader to suspend their belief and become immersed in the story and its characters. And third, unbridled dependence on character tropes can stifle your own creativity and originality, making your story feel as shallow as a fake blog post written by ChatGPT. So be careful about relying too heavily on character tropes to carry your narrative. Keep your reader guessing, your characters round, and your creative juices flowing by using tropes the right way. Segment 4. The impact of tropes on storytelling. If you're going to use character tropes, it's important to understand how they will affect your narrative. Character tropes are so fundamental to storytelling that it will have a great amount of influence on plot development, character dynamics, and audience engagement. These archetypical characters serve as familiar touchstones for the audience, and will flag to the reader what type of narrative they are reading by tapping into shared cultural expectations and storytelling conventions. This means you need to be aware of what character tropes represent before throwing them into your story. One significant aspect of character tropes is their role in shaping plot development. By embodying recognizable archetypes such as the hero, mentor, villain, characters provide narrative frameworks that drive the progression of the story. For instance, the hero's journey plot structure, as covered in Episode 2 of Author Adjacent, often dictates the protagonist's trajectory, leading them through trials, setbacks, and eventual triumphs. This familiar group of characters and the structure not only provides a roadmap for the plot, but also helps readers navigate the thematic and emotional landscape of the story. The other day, my wife watched a movie called Just Before I Go, about a man who contemplates suicide. While I expected this to be a depressing movie, she actually said it was quite the opposite, and filled with interesting dialogue and valuable life lessons. She told me she knew very quickly that the main character would not die at the end because it simply wasn't that kind of movie. Instead, he embodies a non-traditional anti-hero. He causes the rest of the characters in the movie to evaluate their lives and decide to pursue true happiness. Thanks to tropes, she was able to quickly assess that the movie was a comedy rather than a tragedy. All thanks to tropes. Moreover, character tropes influence audience engagement by eliciting specific responses and expectations. Readers are drawn to characters they can relate to and understand, and tropes offer a shorthand for conveying complex motivations and personalities. Whether it's the underdog overcoming adversity or the charming rogue with a heart of gold, these archetypical characters resonate with readers on a visceral level, fostering emotional investment in the narrative. Unfortunately, this also means you will be dealing with readers that dislike the tropes that you choose. So do your homework and learn what tropes tend to do well in your genre. For reference, the value of book sales with the enemies to lovers trope is 10 times higher than those with the love at first sight trope, according to data from publisher Rocket. So when I say it's worth doing your homework about tropes in your genre, I mean it. Segment 5. Crafting Original Characters. Alright folks, we finally made it here. How are we going to be using character tropes to make our own, fresh, exciting original characters? Developing original characters within the framework of character tropes requires a delicate balance between familiarity and innovation. While tropes provide a foundation for character creation, writers must infuse their characters with depth, complexity, and uniqueness to avoid cliches and stereotypes. One strategy for crafting original characters is to start with a familiar trope as a base and then subvert or invert it to add unexpected twists and nuances. By challenging traditional character expectations, writers can create multi-dimensional characters that defy easy categorization and surprise readers with their depth and complexity. As with all things, utilizing character tropes effectively has to do with balance. We can't just copy a trope, throw it in our novels and say, ta-da, with the expectation of instant success. The recipe is not that simple, but it's simpler than you might guess. What you may have noticed in the examples I gave earlier is that all the characters are strongly tied to their character trope, but are changed to create something new in the context of their story. So the question is, how much do you, as the writer, change from the trope? While there are not many actual numbers thrown around, I'm personally a fan of B. Dave Walter's strategy of 20%. In his co-hosted podcast, Writing About Dragons and Shit, he explains that you can take any idea from any source, and as long as the changes you make to it feel like roughly 20%, you'll create a story that can be called yours. The same rule is true of characters and the tropes they are based off of. The reason this rings true is because all stories have been told in one form or another. While that may sound like the death rattle of your inner artist, don't despair, because what makes a story your story, unique and worth telling, is that you are the one telling it, from your perspective. So if you find a trope that you want to use in your story and don't want it to be too close to the original mold, change it by 20%, and it will feel fresh, new, and yours. Like Benoit Blanc, Pete the Prospector, and Moraine Damodred. All three of them stick closely to their role in the story, basing much of their narrative utility on the character trope they came from. But by differing from their trope by at least 20%, they are fresh, exciting, and new to the reader. Another approach is to focus on character growth and development throughout the narrative. While tropes may provide initial character traits and motivations, it's essential to allow characters to evolve organically over the course of the story. By exploring their flaws, vulnerabilities, and internal conflicts, writers can imbue their characters with authenticity and relatability, making them more compelling and memorable to the readers. A great example of such a character is Tyrion Lannister, from George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series. At the beginning, Tyrion embodies the classic trope of the deadpan snarker, using his sharp tongue as a defensive mechanism against the scorn and ridicule he faces due to his stature. However, as the story progresses, Tyrion's character evolves beyond his stereotype. He demonstrates intelligence, empathy, and strategic acumen, becoming a complex and multifaceted individual with a deep sense of moral ambiguity. Despite his start at the beginning of the story, Tyrion's journey showcases growth, resilience, and the capacity for redemption, challenging the initial perceptions of him solely as a trope. Ultimately, crafting original characters within the context of tropes requires a nuanced understanding of storytelling conventions, as well as a willingness to push boundaries and take creative risks. By prioritizing character complexity, growth, and authenticity, we author-adjacent writers can create characters that resonate with our readers on a profound level, transcending the limitations of tropes to become truly unforgettable. So there you have it. Now you know the basics of character tropes. If you want to learn more about character tropes or tropes of other categories such as setting, genre, or plot tropes, I highly suggest checking out tvtropes.org. Their organization has spent years organizing and categorizing every trope known to man and bear kind. If you didn't understand that joke, check out episode 2 of Author Adjacent, Narrative Structure, because maps save lives, where you can listen to me make that joke for the first time. Anyways, you can spend literal months, possibly years, reading all the information the good people at tvtropes.org have collected. I'll be sure to drop the URL into the episode notes below. Alright folks, that's going to wrap it up for character tropes on this episode of Author Adjacent. Thanks for chilling with me today. Once again, I am Michael Vadney. If any of this was helpful or even just gave you a good chuckle, consider supporting the show by leaving a review on your podcast platform of choice or telling a friend about the show. For more Author Adjacent, you can follow me on X at Author Adjacent or shoot me an email at authoradjacent@gmail.com with your burning questions, comments, or topic ideas. New episodes drop every other week, so stay tuned. Now remember, the journey from writer to author might be long, but until then, let's be author adjacent together.